I'm Connie Burnham. I'm the Emergency Management Coordinator, for lack of a better title probably, for the University of Missouri Extension. And we have an emergency management program, and it is comprised of a state team, which we call our campus team, and then we also have regional teams out in the field. So we have extension offices in every county, and they are covered by faculty that do bring forth some of the work that you're doing here, which is what the role of extension is to take research-based information to the public and share it. So before I begin this exciting talk about flood insurance, I just want to tell you that there are a lot of faculty members out there, and that they may be an opportunity for you to use and not abuse, but to work with, collaborate with on some of the issues that you're dealing with in your research. So when you're looking for someone to help you, instead of maybe looking outside, look within. And extension is that. It is a huge group of people that can actually help bring forth some of the results that you're testing. They're also in the they're also in their local area. They're in a county. And so some of these things that you're trying to prove and trying to, implement, that's the place. That's where you're trying to get your research to, is implementing it out there. So please make sure that you use us as much as possible. My contact information is at the end, but it's burnhamc@missouri.edu. You can easily find me. So please, let me know if there's anything else I can help you with. Okay, so this morning, or afternoon now, we're going to talk about the value of flood insurance. I've been involved in emergency management for many, many years. Usually it was on the response side, because I worked for the State Emergency Management Agency for over 8 years, and I did a lot of work, but most of it was on that part of emergency management. When I took over this role, probably about 4 years ago, it is really more about the recovery of communities. Not that our faculty cannot work with our emergency managers on preparedness and mitigation and that. But mainly we are focused on trying to help communities recover. And so when we started having, again, flooding, and we've had 4 major floods in the state of Missouri since July of 2015. We had one in July of 15. We had one in December, which was over Christmas weekend. So nobody was paying any attention, including myself, to realizing what was happening. Went from one end of the state to the other on the southern side. Then we had another one that was in May of 17, tracked about the same way, except it hit even more counties. And now we have the one in 19, and this is like incredible the destruction that it is doing to our citizens and to the infrastructure of our state. And we're not the only state that's dealing with it. So one of the issues that we run across every time we have a flood is the issue of flood insurance. Do you have flood insurance? And if the answer is no, and you have been flooded, you are out of luck. And I'm not kidding you. Every time I see one of these, they say, oh, look at that bridge, that house that just hit that bridge. And all I'm thinking of is, how many people are going to be surprised by the fact that their homeowner's insurance does not cover flood? And that, if you want to talk about the impact that can have, if you had to rebuild your house without any funds coming in and continue to pay a mortgage, this is the story. So flooding is generally, I can say not generally, but it is the most common and costliest type of disaster that Missouri experiences. And the standard, as I just said, the standard homeowner's insurance does not cover flooding. I've mentioned this to many people, and they've said, well, we'll have to go home and check our homeowner's policy. And I said, well, good luck with that. Because I said, you don't see any insurance companies rushing out to write checks for people, because if you do not have it, and I don't care if you live on the highest mountain, it doesn't make any difference where you are. if you think there's never a chance in the whole world that I'm going to be impacted, if you have flooding, you are not covered for your home. So the National Flood Insurance Program was created by Congress in '68 to help alleviate this problem, because the insurance companies were saying, you know, we can't handle this anymore. Because you think about all of the flooding events that have occurred, not only in Missouri, but just across the United States. And they just said, you know, we're not able to handle that, so they created this, the National Flood Insurance Program, and it's managed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And we have, and you know, I invited colleagues that are outside of the university here, because I wanted, the colleagues that I invited were like FEMA and SEMA, and EPA were invited, mental health from the state. So, you know, we have the people that actually work in these programs and see the effects of these events that are here at the table. So they're also a resource. I mean, I can connect you with a lot of different resources out there in terms of who are some of these people that you should be talking with if you're trying to do research and you need information, and then how to, again, implement it out there. So who can buy flood insurance? First of all, just because you say, I want to buy flood insurance doesn't mean necessarily that you can, unless you're either the city that you're residing in or the county has decided that they are going to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. You can be a county, and the whole county can be included. It can be cities that are included. Doesn't make any difference. But they have to follow. They have to first of all adopt and then enforce the floodplain management ordinances that meet or exceed FEMA's requirements. There are counties and cities in this state that have not done that because, well, for whatever reason, they chose not to do that. These are the ones that still get impacted time after time after time. And this is when people find out that what their government decided for them on the local level is now impacting them, because now they find out that their homeowner's insurance is not going to cover them, and they can't buy, and some of them have found out just before that they couldn't buy insurance even if they wanted to because of it. So, but these are the people, or the groups that can actually buy, if that is met. That first requirement is homeowners, renters, and many times we don't have renters that get renter's insurance for anything. But for sure, they probably are not even thinking about renter's insurance for flooding. And then business owners. And that's important for people to know. And that is something that you may not know much about this program. I'm not an authority for sure on this, but I'm just telling you that if there's anything that you can get out to the public, this is the stuff. When you're sitting around the table talking to your family or your friends, you might want to mention these sort of things, especially if they live in an area that could flood. So although I may not live in an area that the flood maps say I should, have insurance, as Karen McHugh, who's the state administrator of the National Flood Insurance Program for Missouri, she says everybody should buy flood insurance because you never know. So here's some facts that I wanted to bring forth to you. So homeowners, 85% more likely to use flood insurance policies during a 30-year mortgage rather than the homeowner's policy. I found that extremely interesting. I would have never, ever thought of that. So that means that flooding is probably more, that could be more of a problem than fires or tornadoes or, severe winter storms or, whatever, might happen. So that's one of the facts. Missouri has 675 NFIP participating communities, and this is according, again, to the state, to Karen McHugh. More than 20% of NFIP claims are submitted by people who own property outside of the high-risk area, which means the ones that are required to have it, maybe because of the mortgage that they carry or whatever, but 20%. So there are people that buy flood insurance even though it's not maybe required that they do that. Living in an area with a high risk of flooding has a 25% chance of the home being flooded over a 30-year mortgage. Living in an area with moderate to low risk zones, the chances are lower, but still possible, which is why Karen says everybody should buy flood insurance. The historic 2017 flooding that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, 19 million was paid to policyholders before there was a federal disaster declared, which means, they weren't, it would be like if they had had a tornado. They just called their insurance agent, took care of their flood insurance, and said, my house has been flooded, and going from there. So they didn't wait till the government said, oh yeah, there's a declaration, and you might get this or this or this, because they didn't have to. So, but that's an amazing amount, 19 million paid to policy owners, and that is here. And then another fact from that same flooding is 26% of NFIP claims filed were not in a specific flood hazard area, again, the mandatory areas. So 26%, again, there were people outside of that area that said, I do need it. Now, maybe they had been flooded before. I don't have any idea what would spur them on to do that, or if their mortgage company said, you must have it. But for whatever reason, that's quite a big percentage. Okay, nationwide, only a third of all homes in a floodplain have flood insurance. So that means that when these communities are flooded, then they have a lot of people that are either going to have to rebuild their homes by themselves or walk away from the mortgage. And in Missouri, the federal policies have fallen by a third since 2011. And some of that, I think, is probably the price of flood insurance. Some of these people that, and I've talked to them. I mean, I was in Northwest Missouri, and I was talking to people who had been flooded out. One person had 2 places, and she said, well, we paid flood insurance on one, but not on the other. There are people that, yes, they had flood insurance, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them are renters, and they wouldn't. When you talk to these people, when you see, how it really impacts people, that really stays with you. Trust me, it's way different than some of the other things that I do, but those are the things that when I see that, it's a tragedy that, people have made decisions that will so impact them. So what's the impact to our communities, our state, and our nation? Because, it's not just on the local level that it impacts. It impacts us as we go up, on the state level, and then, on the federal level as well. People walk away from their mortgages. If you do that, all of a sudden you start causing problems within the financial institutions that there are. People moving from the area, think about that. What happens? People move from an area, businesses leave because they don't have any customers. School systems that were planning on having 300 children now have, 200 children, or may have 5 kids in a class that was, destined to have 15, or whatever the number you want to put in there. So, and this happened in Van Buren. Van Buren, Missouri, was one of them that was flooded. They lost 52 kids out of the school system, and you can imagine that's a small school system anyway. At a cost of $6,000 federal aid for each one of those. Now, to us, that is a drop in the bucket. That is nothing in our school systems. But to that small school, that could be a teacher. I think they got a few of them back, but still, there's a lot of people that probably left because maybe their homes were not, rebuildable, or they couldn't stay. Social organizations lose members and support. We're talking about, churches. I mean, if churches don't have members, or they don't have money to continue, or other social organizations that are out there. So when you lose those, you lose part of your community. So it's a incredible situation that we find ourselves in with this flood insurance. And when I look at Arkansas, some of the homes that were built down there that have been flooded because they didn't have to have flood insurance possibly, there's going to be some numbers coming out of there. I'm very interested in Nebraska, same way. So the last thing is, so how do we solve this problem? When we have people that are living in these areas that a lot of times are, have, low income, poverty level, that cannot afford and do not have flood insurance. It impacts then how we can respond. So a lot of those things that you guys are talking about here, about especially like the mental health and things like that. It's incredible how this one decision could really impact and cause some of these other issues. And when people get stressed, they do all kinds of crazy stuff, spousal abuse, child abuse, drugs, alcohol. I mean, everything. You just think about it, it just tumbles downhill, one thing after the other. So that is just a rhetorical question because, you don't have the answer to it. I mean, I guess the answer is if everybody would buy flood insurance, we'd probably be okay. But that's probably not going to happen. But it is something that I think that you should keep in mind when you're doing some of this research, that you're thinking about some of this other information that you might need. So I did, the two sources that I used for this information was the SEMA website, which is Missouri, the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency. And they have under programs, they have their Missouri Floodplain Management, Floodplain Insurance Programs, and that's where I got a lot of this information. And then the second source I used was a New York Times article that came out June 8th of this year, and it was, even as floods worsen with climate change, fewer people insure against disaster. So those two things you might, and they quoted, Missouri, they quoted Nebraska and a couple other states. So, that would be if you are interested in looking for that information. I don't know where Kieran's. Well, Kieran's page that I had all her information on is not there, but you can always find me, and you can always just go to, again, the SEMA website, and you can find Kieran McHugh, and it's MCHUGH, so it's kind of an interesting spelling for a pronunciation for that spelling. So anyway, again, here's my contact information. I don't know what kind of time we have left, probably none, right? So anyway, anybody has any questions, you can always find me. I'm always around. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Check. Okay, you're live.
All right, thanks. Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started on the last session, which is the environmental resilience. So again, feel free to get some dessert on the south side of the room here. But I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Gillis, who's an associate professor of rural sociology from MU. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. What I'm trying to do today is really talk a little bit about my work, but talk about a group of us in the Division of Applied Social Sciences who have called ourselves since 2013 the Translational Research Group, cluster, not group. We feel there's no trademark infringement on the part of President Cho or anything for this, but we will continue calling ourselves that. And the title comes from, this is made up of agricultural economists, adult educators, rural sociologists, and communication people, and includes people from outside our division. The title comes from our experience that many times the technologies, practices, and policies that come after years of work seeking for the ideal solution or the optimal solution never work, or work for 10% of the target population. And so, because in order to come up with an optimal solution, you have to make simplifying assumptions and ignore the diversity that exists out in the world you're trying to help. So that is what we're about. Our focus is on populations and communities that are dependent on natural resources. This could be agriculture, food processing, or communities that are dependent on outdoor tourism. Most of our work is, a little over half of our work is in low-income and medium, middle-income countries, but we do also work with immigrant populations and with issues related to local food systems. So a large amount of our work over the years was in evaluation. And basically, we've invented a better mousetrap, and the people aren't using it, or they don't like it, or the government won't change regulations to allow us to use it. And this seemed like an extremely wasteful approach. And so after many years, and it also makes a social scientist be the bad guy. You know, somebody works 12 years on golden rice, and after 12 years of work and 3 years of research and trying to get people to adopt it, you tell them, it tastes bad. It is not the kind of news that makes social scientists welcome or happy either. So what we're trying to do is create meaningful knowledge. And by meaningful knowledge, I really mean that knowledge that is relevant to a person's context, that they trust, and that they can use. Probably the difference between our approach, if there is a difference, and other approaches that try to do meaningful communication of technology is that we also see as part of the system a lack of meaningful knowledge often on the part of the people that develop technology or policies. Is basically often the criticisms of their work are ignored simply because they're not relevant to the context or not in a way that's trusted by the scientist. So scientists often get into binds because they did get information that could have been useful but not from a source they considered trustworthy. So that is what we try to do, is we try to create meaningful knowledge. And the way we create meaningful knowledge, the way we try to create meaningful knowledge is to have all stakeholders involved in a technology or a policy work together from the beginning to design the policy, to evaluate it, design the technology or evaluate it, so that there won't be glitches along the way. And so, for example, developing a policy and not including the implementing agency probably isn't a good idea, even though you may have had hearings or you may have sent out a survey to them. Not having it intimately involved in the process is probably not a good idea. A lot of knowledge that practitioners have is tacit knowledge. Practitioners don't have to know why something doesn't work. They just have to know it doesn't work and they're not going to do it again. So we spend a lot of time managing those kinds of things. I'll give you a very short example of our work. We've been working in the Andean highlands for about 15, 16 years. And it's one of the two areas besides the polar regions that has experienced the most temperature change. Basically, polar regions and high altitudes are the regions. So over the last 50 years, they've experienced a little more than 1 degree centigrade of warming. That's roughly double the planetary level of warming. And they expect in the next 50 years to also experience double the global warming. And so adaptation is critical in this context. But it can't occur if you can't forecast weather and weather events. And there's not an operational weather system in this region for small farmers at these high altitudes. In fact, according to our surveys, only 2% of farmers even bother to listen to weather forecasts on the radio or television. Only 2%. So we decided to create a community of practice to try to figure out how to do that, how to improve it. And we found two things that was important. One, that farmers relied more on their own local knowledge and traditional knowledge. And so we decided to evaluate that scientifically. And second, we decided to evaluate the products of the weather system. What we found as a result of this is that farmers are much better at forecasting long-term and medium-term weather conditions than are the meteorological services, and incredibly bad at forecasting short-term under 15 to 20 days. Incredibly bad. And we're talking about predicting R squared of about 0.6 of predicting annual precipitation, which is really incredibly good. So what we're trying to do is two things: develop a locally based system that includes, based on local weather systems, local weather knowledge, and local weather stations through Weather Underground of all things, and to try to create better forecasts and create a menu of adaptation strategies on the one hand. On the other hand, what we're trying to do is figure out why these forecast mechanisms work. We know, we've worked with meteorologists, we know that, for example, on the dates they observe natural phenomena are dates where the pattern of the jet streams change. We've got that far, but that's all we know. So what would we look for in terms of collaboration from our colleagues? First, we enjoy working with other disciplines. In fact, all our work is with other disciplines, mostly in agriculture and physical sciences. We, in the case of Bolivia, we need to figure out what are the physical bases for these highly skilled predictions that people are making, so that this work can be outscaled to other parts of the world. And so we're interested in collaboration in terms of engineers and meteorologists to try to help us figure that out. Secondly, we're looking for collaborators in other fields. We have a model for translational research, but we need to test it in other areas, both in the United States and outside the United States. As I said, most of our work to date is either in the United States is with immigrant groups, but and a little bit with local food systems. But I think this is something that would fit into a lot of people's effort if they're trying to work on the area of broader impacts in their research. And so with that, I will say thank you.
Hey, thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Fitchie, who is I'll get this right, your title, C. Alice Donaldson Professor of Bioenergy, Crop Physiology, and Genetics here at MU. Welcome, Felix.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm here to tell you that plants are amazing, right? Plants are truly amazing. And I think many of you guys, certainly those from Columbia, Missouri here, you've been down to the McBain Bur Oak, you've seen pictures of it, and maybe even recently, you've seen this magnificent tree in the water, right? I think Kent Nichols has a video that circulated showing it in flood water. But this is a tree that's about 400 years old, right? It's anchored in the ground. It cannot move, but it's awesome, right? It survived, it thrives, and provides all kinds of benefits, including for our enjoyment. And so the questions that I'm interested in is, what are the plant mechanisms that allow success under extreme conditions? That includes limited water availability or too much water. And of course, plant life forms differ. We have a big tree, and then in the front of here, we have the annual crops that really feed us, right? And that's really the focus of my work. And this is a picture, or a couple pictures here, that illustrates what happens to corn. In one case, on the left side, is an event, not enough water, 2012, where we had a strong drought. In the middle is kind of a corn ear that we would love to see, to have on every plant. And then on the right side is actually excess water, right? And clearly there is a dramatic effect on yield. Even if the plant is there, it doesn't mean that it has good yield, okay? So water, from one extreme to the other, critically influences plant growth and development, okay? And so it's of primary importance for the energy, carbon dioxide, oxygen balance. We heard earlier about canopy cooling, saving people's lives, right? So the water balance is absolutely critical for the plant, okay? And so what we're trying to understand and study is the strategies that plants use to access water, to regulate water transport through the plant, and control its loss, the amount of loss that occurs through the leaves at different temporal and spatial scales, okay? And clearly, this is extremely important for Missouri and well beyond Missouri. These are statistics from the crop insurance industry that show that every year, drought is the most important factor for Missouri farmers in terms of crop insurance indemnity payments. And the challenge for us is that floods or excess water are the second most important just about every year, right? And of course, you can see it goes up and down, and we all know, living in Missouri, that one year it may be flood, this year, another year it may be drought, right? From the perspective of improving plants, that makes it really, really challenging, okay? And so as a big industry associated with that, a lot of value in the crops, soybean and corn in Missouri. So the toolbox that I use in my program and a lot of other colleagues at Missouri here are natural genetic variation that is present in crop plants, right? Mutations, natural mutations that help us study how specific genes or regions of the genome respond, as well as transgenic technologies to help us study that. And the other thing that we do, and I think is rather unique around Missouri, is we generated the ability, or around the nation and globe to some extent, we generated the ability to make disasters, right? Using drought simulators, we have a network of 4 across the state, as well as a flood lab that, of course, allow us to study these extreme situations on a repeated basis. So the saying is that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? These days, to me, a picture is worth maybe 1,000,000 data points, right? So to study the plants and their responses to different environmental extremes, we have gone to phenotyping methodologies that a lot of them involve sensors that allow us to produce images. And so we study the pathway of water through the plant. And these are some examples that we work with engineers on where we study above ground tissues. From single cell type of levels and tissues, microscopy, all the way to satellite-based images to try to differentiate which plants respond in which manner to a certain stress conditions. And so along that spatial scale, we involve different tools. We work closely with colleagues in engineering. Guy de Sosa is the one that working with us to develop a robot that helps us then reconstruct the plants in 3 dimensions virtually, so we can try to answer all kinds of questions about how that plant responds. Of course, the chute is the interface with the atmosphere that drives water transport to the plant. But uptake happens at the roots. So we also study roots, again, taking advantage of natural diversity. But if you look at these kind of 2 pictures in the middle here, our traditional approach, the reason why very few people actually study roots, because they're hard to get at. They're in the ground, so we use shovels and backhoes, and then we go in and manually map it. These days now we have tools, and we are developing novel tools to assay roots non-destructively in the soil in the fields. We're working with engineers, Scott Kowaleski, on X-ray based technology, transmission X-ray, backscatter X-ray technology that allows us to look into the soil and assess how plant roots respond to different stress conditions. So these few images here kind of show a potential interface, in my opinion, with hopefully some of you in the crowd here, right? For us, I'm a biologist, and I need a lot of help, okay, to study and better understand the plants. We have done a lot of fundamental and continue to do reductionist science. But now with new tools, new sensors, we need help with developing new sensors, adapting new sensors, and then use the data from those sensors to interpret them, to scale up from the reductionist approaches to the system level. That involves modeling and all the way from the gene to the whole plant to the ecosystem to help us better understand and predict what kind of features do our plants need to have. So this is kind of my list of things, and it could go on a lot longer, that aspects that I need help with. So thank you.
Okay, I gotta push this down a little. Our next speaker is Damon Hall. He's an assistant professor in the School of Natural Resources, and he also has a joint appointment in the College of Engineering. So, thank you.
Thank you. I want to talk today about the research my lab is conducting on the United States' longest undammed river, the Yellowstone River in Montana, and the implications for planning for resilience. This research is rooted in the emerging field of sustainability science, which argues that indeed we can plan for resilience when we have a sophisticated understanding of the biophysical system and an equally sophisticated understanding of the social system. So I'll talk about the Yellowstone River, about some of the challenges that are disastrous on there, and then the approach that we have to research and how that's transferable to other problems. The Yellowstone River is a tributary to the Missouri River. 692 miles long, headwaters are above Yellowstone National Park, and it has no impoundment dam on it. All of these features make it loaded with social and cultural capital, in that it has the lower falls in Yellowstone National Park is the river. It has a historical legacy as being a route back from the Pacific Ocean from Lewis and Clark, as well as 2 endangered species of fish. And these amenities make this stream a blue ribbon fly fishing stream, trout stream. These same amenities attract people to the river, and folks want to live on the river and close to the river. There are a number of second homes that have popped up in the past 20 years. Every June, the snow in the mountains melt, and that causes flooding. The locals call it the June rise. And all of this flood water, of course, has various levels of erosion that accompany it. And so what landowners can do, provided they have money, they can install bank stabilization processes in order to prevent this velocity of the water from cutting out the banks. However, this effectively narrows the stream and begins to scour out the bottom of the river. And federal courts have ruled that this poses problems to the multi-million-dollar trout fishery there. So one solution to one problem causes other problems. This same scour also exposes oil and gas pipelines, and occasionally there are breaks in these pipelines. Few systems can teach us about planning for resilience than an undammed river. What it tells us is that we have to understand the biophysical features of that river and the biophysical behaviors, as well as the social behaviors and human behaviors on that river. And it forces us to communicate with upstream and downstream users, and it forces us to collaborate. And so this is one quote that I really like from Dan Lurch about planning for resilience. Is building resilience means intentionally guiding a system's process of adaptation so as to preserve some qualities and allow others to fade away, all while retaining the essence or the identity of the system. So what my research does is we work with communities at a community level to begin to identify what are those functional identities or the essence of those communities, through in-depth conversations, a lot of one-on-one conversations with landowners and key stakeholders. This work is funded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They've been very interested in this work. They fund us across several projects. And we simply find those key stakeholders within the system, and we'll travel across 600 miles. We'll drive out to their farms, ranches, and homes, sit around their kitchen table and talk with them about what matters to them and what they think should be done regarding management. These are all digitally audio recorded, transcribed, put into large qualitative databases, which we analyze them and then create reports used for decision making. So these reports and these data have been used in a number of different practices. One example is the 2015 Montana State Water Plan. Here we were invited, based on these data, to coordinate a series of conversations, these tough conversations about what should be kept within the system and perhaps what should be allowed to fade away. So we hosted these. We are also using the same approach to stakeholder engagement and research and data generation to other projects. And so one project I have right now is addressing global declines of insect pollinators. And so we are working with stakeholders and residential homeowners in St. Louis to ask some of those vital questions about what is it about the lawn that maybe we should allow to fade away? You know, what do we want to keep so it can still remain a lawn and usable, but when we're thinking about global declines of bees and habitat needs of other insect pollinators, what perhaps should we talk about moving on from? Across all these projects, a statement from Jack Ward Thomas, the former chief of the U.S. Forest Service, still rings true with me, and that is managing natural resources is 5% managing nature and 95% managing people. Our behaviors are often what is causing disasters or challenges. And so it's important to have these sophisticated understandings of the biophysical system as well as the social system. But when you truly want to engage public in planning and decision making and policy making, you really need to know the people. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Lac Milus, who is an assistant professor of geosciences, geological, and petroleum engineering at MS&T. Welcome here.
That's funny, all the colors are gone. Anyway, so I'm going to be doing something slightly different now. Instead of showing you a project that we currently are working on, I'm going to be showing you what our plans are for the future, because I think today is a great possibility to really start cross-campus collaborations, and I'm already looking over there to Dr. Fritchie. Okay, so basically at Missouri S&T these days we're trying to put up a new research initiative that will help us to better understand how hazardous contaminants behave during and after catastrophic flood events. So we're basically trying to see what kind of contaminants can we expect, what are the most dangerous ones, and where do they actually come from, and where do they go. So we're trying to really develop models that will help us to understand what areas in a given river system are most likely to contain contaminants and concentrations that are high enough to really pose health threats. And that sounds simple and sounds like something that we should have done already a long time ago. But from a geochemical perspective, these kind of systems still remain poorly understood, simply for the reason that when you're looking at it from a purely geological scale, flood events that are really catastrophic are relatively rare and relatively short-lived, which I know is hard to believe when you drive from Rolla to Columbia because everything was flooded on the way. But from a geological perspective, they're kind of difficult to study. That being said, this issue becomes more and more important simply for the reason that over the next few years and decades, we expect weather patterns to become much more extreme. So we expect more floods in the future, and we also expect those floods to become much more devastating. And I think right now we're at a point in time where, like Mark mentioned early this morning, if we really start to bundle our resources and start to work together as a University of Missouri system, then we can really become the global leader in all kinds of interdisciplinary flood-related research. And now I'm going to be showing you a little bit about the project we're currently starting in Missouri S&T that will help us to really get the ball rolling. So a while back we submitted an NSF RAPID proposal, and we hope that we get this one approved over the next maybe couple of weeks. And as soon as we have this one approved, we're going to be going to Omaha, Nebraska. And what you can see up here, so Omaha and the Missouri and Platte River usually look like when everything is nice and everything is dry. And down here you can see how it looked earlier this year. So the entire area near the Elkhorn, Platte, and Missouri rivers is completely flooded. So as part of the rapid proposal, we try to go out to the field as soon as possible, and we're going to be collecting as many soil, sediment, and water samples, and then to really analyze the geochemical composition to get an understanding of post-flood contaminant baselines. So you want to see what kind of contaminants can we basically expect that are derived from agricultural areas, what can we expect is being run off from urbanized areas, and what happens to areas where we have both urban and agricultural input. So what kind of contaminants can we expect, and can we use this one really to help rural and agricultural development strategies by identifying the areas that are at most risk to undergo significant contamination. So directly in the future, we just really try to go to the field, collect data as fast as possible, and collect a year one baseline. The long-term goal, however, is to really establish a long-term research initiative that will help us to really revisit the same sample sites again and again every single year for the next 3, 5, or maybe 10 years. So the goal here is that we're really trying to understand for how long does it take a system to bounce back to normal conditions. So in the beginning, we're just going to be looking at soil samples, sediment samples, and water samples. So geological materials that we are very familiar with, and we can do this work. That being said, in the long term, we also want to look into wildlife and crops, which is something that is not that geological. So we're really looking for collaborations within the University of Missouri system that will help us to address these questions in the future. And one thing that we're currently having in mind are fish otolith studies. So if you're a fish that lives in a pond and the pond gets flooded, well, the pond is like a big hole. So it can act as a sink for all the hazardous contaminants that are mobilized during a flood. And basically, if you're a fish that lives in the pond, you get contaminated, and it can basically enter the food chain if we start to catch and eat the fish. In our case, we're trying to assess this by otolith studies. So otoliths are ear bones, and we're looking at this example here from walleye. We can see that they have very distinct rings. And you can roughly treat them the same way as you treat a tree ring, and by really analyzing the geochemical composition of each individual ring, you can tell how the water quality was, how the fish was affected by the water quality, and you can do all of these things basically as a function of time. We're also going to be looking at crop growth experiments, trying to see what kind of contaminants can go into crops using the baseline concentrations for our experiments that we established in year one. And the idea here is, of course, that a lot of the areas in the Midwest that are really prone to catastrophic flooding, they rely on crop growth as their major source of income, as a major driver for economy. Like Dr. Fritchie said, $4 billion million of dollars in the Midwest, in the Missouri area, are potentially at risk if we have these floods continuing in the future. Okay, but that's pretty much all that I have to say for today. If this is anything that interests you and you want to collaborate with us on that, I'll be here all day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Corns, who is an associate professor of engineering management and systems engineering at MS&T.
Okay, so we're going to keep doing flooding, I guess, because that seems to be a theme. And all you guys are probably a little bit familiar with it. So I work artificial intelligence, machine learning, computational intelligence. There's all kinds of names for it, basically trying to get computers to look at all the data and find some kind of similarity, some way of predicting an outcome using this big data. So this is a project we've been working on with MoDOT. So we are looking at how can you predict flood at maybe a little bit tighter scale. Currently, we can predict, is the Missouri River going to be flooded down in Jefferson City tomorrow? Well, yeah, probably. But what roads are going to be blocked off? When do we start closing roads? So this is MoDOT looking for a tool where they can figure out when to close down a road so that they don't have to keep saying, turn around, don't drown. Then they can have the road closed. People aren't going to have to face that decision. I just drove 45 minutes down this road. I see a little bit of water over it. Maybe I can make it, maybe I can't. If we can close the roads before they start going down that road, then we can keep people from trying to make that decision. So that's kind of the goal of this piece of work. We got a bunch of stuff here. We're looking at flood prediction. We're looking at different roads. So I do systems engineering. I like to take all these different sources of information, create different models, kind of staple, hammer, glue, put these models together so that we can get a bigger system level perspective of what's going on. So no news to anybody here, but these were predicted, right? Did not predict up here in Nebraska when the levees breached, but they had a pretty good idea what was going on. So one of the folks that we're going to be talking to is NOAA, and we're actually coordinate with them with some of their models. They do a pretty good flood prediction job. So we're going to play around with some of that. We're also looking at working with USGS. We're actually collaborating with them, have been for about 5 years on disaster restoration. So now we're moving into how do we step through this to make these kinds of predictions. And as I said, MoDOT. So we got a bunch of different data, historical data. We have data that they're gathering now. We have river level data, precipitation models, all these different things we can tie together. And so historical data, what's happened in the past, try to learn from that. The NOAA data, different spots, areas. Unfortunately, I couldn't grab a Missouri picture, but New England. They do a really good job of figuring out where rainfall is, where all the different weather events are going to be, how this is going to impact particular areas. So we combine that with this digital elevation models, and this is something that USGS has been putting together along with the national map. If any of you guys like maps, they have a ton of maps. And a lot of this stuff, if we look at this particular area, we're looking at about a 1 meter resolution, which is your laser LiDAR type of data. So with this information, we can start putting together a model of how much water will fit in an area. Then you calculate in, well, how much water actually gets absorbed in the ground, how much evaporates, and all this turns into, like I like to tell my students, it's first law of thermodynamics. In minus out equals change. So what is that change in the water level? This gives us a way of predicting what the flood's going to be. We're working with NOAA on this, comparing some of our different machine learning neural network type things. And this gives us a way of predicting that piece. So once we have an idea about what the water level is going to be, then we can start looking and examining how's that going to impact the roads. So going back to this elevation data, not only can we use that to predict what the water level is going to be, we also can identify where the roads are. So I didn't bring a picture of the national map, but it's also at about 1 to 3 meter resolution, depending on where you're at. And we can figure out the elevation of different roads. And these roads form a network. We can create a road network, and we've done this in previous work with disaster restoration, national hazards publications. So we can create a network and a matrix representation of this, of how they're connected, what the distance are on those connections, and when it will flood compared to this water level data. So we can start closing off roads. This road needs to be closed off when the water level gets to this height. We compare that to the flood model, and now we have a way of dynamically changing our network to update what the road conditions are, what roads are probably flooded. You guys have all seen the prediction stuff. Do you guys believe all the predictions that we give you? This road's going to be closed because it's flooding, and you see no water. So that's another aspect that we could probably use some help with. We can do all these computer models and stuff, but some of the social folks, how do you get consumer buy-in? We're decent with that. We're engineering management, so we do management type stuff. But how do you actually get some of the social factors included in that? So I know at least one of the folks over at UMSL I was interested in talking to at some point, dealing with communities. How do you get buy-in from that? But being able to dynamically change these models, do updates so that we can figure out when is it going to flood, when do we close the roads, and when do we keep people from having to make that bad decision. And that's kind of the overall goal of this. I can get into a little bit more details of what the deep learning aspect is. If all you guys remember, Google had this big deep learning thing that finally beat the game Go, if any of you know what Go is. Hopefully some of you do. It's looking at what are the strategies for playing this. So what strategies do they come up with countering moves? Well, if you think of Mother Nature as our adversary, hopefully not, but currently it's kind of hard not to think that. well, what is Mother Nature's next move going to be? What's the next road that they're going to close? And can we come up with strategies based on this type of aspect, this type of tool, to predict this road's going to be closed, here's going to be our moves in the next 15 minutes. 15 minutes is going to give us enough time to close roads before it gets dangerous, as opposed to it currently maybe within a day. Very helpful, but when we're looking at a traffic level, a little bit more resolution. I think I'm out of time now. But that's what our model looks like at a high level. And again, any of the social folks, I'd love to talk to you about this. Thanks to all the folks working on it, and thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Phaethon, who is an assistant teaching professor of Spanish at UMSL. So welcome.
Good afternoon. The first known extinction of 2019 happened on New Year's Day when a Hawaiian tree snail named George, named after Lonesome George from the Galapagos, died after spending his life wandering around a terrarium by himself. George's story was reported and promptly forgotten. Species extinction until recently has failed to receive the attention it deserves. A recent United Nations report warns that over 1 billion plant and animal species are at risk of extinction due to the degree and scale to which human economic activity continues to alter the biosphere. Perhaps due to the report's magnitude, as a compilation of previously published research, it is difficult to verbalize a response, let alone formulate a plan of action to mitigate the loss of biodiversity. Indeed, this isn't the first alarm bell, and it will not be the last. One route towards grappling with such emergencies is through mapping the connections between biodiversity and linguistic diversity. On the one hand, such analysis underscores the rich and resilient history of human interaction with the biosphere, while also underscoring the grave threats that many species and cultures face today. How can we reshape our thinking so as to better inhabit the richness of the biosphere? It turns out that Galician, a language spoken in northwestern Spain, basically a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish, has some useful answers for us. Galician author Manuel Rivas has observed that languages are weightless. Linguistic energy is similar to moths flocking around a porch lamp late at night because it alternates or moves in turns. This energy is born of relation. Rivas reflects that there are some things that only exist thanks to their names. He mentions hundreds of synonyms for firefly in Galician. For example, pirilampo, vagalume, lucecus, luciérnagas, lucero, lucerne, ferelume, lucilume, luciluce, vermedaluz, cagafogo, or cagalume. These names, some more directly than others, offer what Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology describes as sensuous or perceivable properties of the bug. Lucy Lucy, for example, conjures the image of a child observing the insects at dusk for the first time. Cagalume is a more colorful interpretation that you can ask me about afterwards. Maybe you're familiar with if you know Spanish at all, right? Vagalume is a more common sign in Galicia, Portugal, and Brazil, and describes them as light wanderers or wandering light. This list grows exponentially if we begin to consider other regions' languages and history. Right? Rivas's point is that these names embody fragments of a narrative about human wonder and amusement when nearby insects practicing native mating rituals. We might describe this kind of interaction as sensuous entanglement, and it is something that we begin to notice once it disappears. Rivas also reflects that there are no photographs of injured languages or amputated words. Do they simply disappear, slowly decay? Do they remain buried in forgotten archives? These traumas, he writes, leave craters in our mouths and sores in the throat of history. Languages do not bear down on us, but rather carry an erased, though not absent, weight of history. If a language were to fade away, we would also lose the sensuous entanglement with glowing nocturnal creatures, as well as these more ominous silences. That is to say, injured, ruptured, or disappeared signs also mark the disappearance of specific relations to, say, for example, a suitcase, a chess game, or an escaping octopus. This is coming from my research here. In brief, we are more aware than ever that many critters, glaciers, and even mountains are disappearing or otherwise unstable in their behavior. This awareness certainly suggests to us that something is wrong. Yet, it is difficult to know what to do with this awareness. To conclude, my final contention is that many remedies, alternatives, and possibilities to help address our spiral towards ecological collapse are to be found within and indeed between languages, especially the many indigenous languages that are in danger of disappearance. Likewise, it is not possible to grapple with how much we lose when a species disappears, for its loss entails unknown effects for future generations. Biodiversity is a richness frequently ignored in mainstream environmental news, but it is certainly one of the greatest sources of our survival. Languages can help us appreciate those sensual qualities and, more broadly, allow for what I would call a re-enchantment of the world. As the Catalan author Joan Maragall suggests, language is, quote, a subtle movement of air that puts before you the immense variety of the world and awakens in you an inkling of the unknown infinite. We should, he writes, speak as though enchanted and awestruck by the variation and mystery of the biosphere. Thinking our way out of species extinction and language death, then, is about a resilience based on collectivity, a delicate confluence of alliances that are to be made with a considerate recognition of difference across the strange isles of coexistence. Thank you.
Also, our next speaker is Dr. Dunlap, who is an assistant professor of biology at UMSL. Welcome.
Right. We're facing a global crisis in biodiversity with a truly stunning loss of species across the tree of life. Causes include habitat degradation, climate change, and the introduction of invasive species and pathogens. These losses are particularly true for insects, and one area where this gets personal, for people at least, is with bees. We have a staggering array of native bees, around 4,000 species in North America. There are over 450 species in Missouri, and this is just a tiny snippet of what you can see outside here. We're losing some of them, but most of them are not well studied enough for us to even know how well they're truly doing. Among those that are well studied, like bumblebees, we find that some species are declining, some are stable, and others are doing spectacularly well. In the face of a changing environment, what causes some bee species to expand their ranges while others are going extinct? Pathogens and pesticides are not explaining the whole picture. A major hypothesis that remains is that some species are more behaviorally plastic than others. They're more flexible in their foraging and in other aspects of their behavior. But behavior is notoriously difficult to study, and most people use proxies for behavior instead of actual behavior. My research group studies animal behavior, so we've been taking on this problem directly. We use approaches from a fairly new field called cognitive ecology. This is the evolution and ecology of learning and memory and decision-making. We use predictions from evolution and economics and apply methods from neuroscience and psychology to understand the ecology of information use. Theory tells us that behavioral flexibility, learning, evolves in response to changing environments. That's why I have a fruit fly up here. We actually test this in fruit flies. We can test this directly with experimental evolution, and once these behaviors evolve, we can look at this affects what type of genes are being expressed in their brains and how this learning ability is affecting other parts of their lives. We found, for instance, that learning is very generalized when it evolves, but innate bias is incredibly specific. We've also found that evolved learning affects the immune system and how well smart flies fight off infections. So we can take all of these tools and lessons and we can apply them to bees. What animals can perceive also affects their choices, and our flies' differences in perception can emerge pretty quickly in evolutionary time. With bees, we're focusing on their color vision. We can measure the wavelengths that are being reflected by the flowers that the bees are choosing, and then we can map this onto bee vision. We're really spending a lot of time studying this color vision in orchid bees, and orchid bees are a tropical bee that was introduced into Florida. It's become really successful there, even though it's a very different environment than what it evolved in. We can also apply predictions from mathematical modeling and from economics. In the lab, in our studies with our very craft-looking flowers here, we've learned that the color preferences that bees are born with have a strong influence on when they'll adopt new resources. Once they learn these new resources, which can take some time, they'll remember them for longer. We've also found that bumblebees are savvy shoppers of the floral marketplace. They can use information from other bees and from flowers in an extremely flexible way. Now we can take these approaches out of the lab and into the field. Some of our native bees are actually doing really well, and they're doing well in places that are surprising to many, for instance, in urban areas. We didn't necessarily predict this. So what we can do is we can look at bees in the city, we can look at bees in native prairies, like this prairie at Shaw Nature Reserve. But at the same time, some of these bees' closest relatives are in decline. So we can use this and compare closely related species to ask the question, what makes a successful bee in a changing world? One thing that we found is that across species of bumblebees in North America, we found that the more variable in size a species is, the more likely it is to be doing well. So not the large bees, not the small bees, but a mix of sizes within the same species. This maps onto some theory about the benefits of living with a large family. Second, when we test the learning of bees directly in the prairies, we find that our declining bumblebee species can take until July or August to score high on our tests. The successful species are smart all summer. This is something that hadn't been described before and something that people hadn't really even looked at. Finally, we're looking for differences in the flowers that bees are visiting from observations and from the pollen that they're carrying. So does better flexibility through learning mean that bees are visiting different types of flowers, or is it making them more likely to visit novel, non-native flowers in the city? Usually when people think about bees, they think about honeybees, but I want to convince you that we really do need our native bees. First, 1 in 3 bites that we eat depend on animal pollination. This is true in our backyards and gardens, like the community garden in Old North St. Louis that I garden in, but it's also true for agriculture more broadly. Native bees contribute over $3 billion a year in pollination services for U.S. crops, our native bees. Bees are keystones, both for the 3/4 of plants on Earth that need animal pollination and for the animals that need those plants to survive. Also, bees are fascinating. They show massive diversity in many aspects of their natural history. They're all quite different in how they nest, how they forage, how they live. We can't study them all with the detail that we need to understand how well they're doing. But by looking for patterns in a few groups, we can use this information to help us predict which species we should be focusing our efforts on, which ones are going to be more likely to suffer due to their pattern of behavioral plasticity. So behavioral flexibility can play a large role in mediating the effects of climate change. And this can be challenging to study, but creative approaches in the lab and in the field can provide insight into both the evolution of behavior across animals and with conservation for our native bees. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Razia, who is an assistant professor of chemical and biochemical engineering at MS&T. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the last speaker, so I think I can talk as long as I want. All right, so today I'd like to talk about biomass-derived carbon conversion to valuable fuels with the potential to be implemented in remote locations. So that's the topic of my talk today. The motivation behind this work is to address climate change while at the same time producing energy for the growing population using a waste chemical feedstock, which is emitted carbon dioxide or CO2. As you can see from this figure, we are currently one of the highest CO2 emissions trajectories. As you can see from this red curve, a prediction of temperature rise of about 3 to 5 degrees C over the next few decades is obvious from here. So we have to do something about these emissions. Here, our approach was to consider CO2 emissions from agricultural bio-waste sources in the form of biogas that could be converted into chemicals or fuels in order to supplement or even replace chemical feedstocks in various industry. Now, why this source of carbon? Basically, because compared to other carbon sources like air, like flue gas coming from power plants or other industries, biogas has higher carbon content, which means thermodynamically is more favorable to get it converted to other chemicals or fuels. So that's the motivation behind this work. Now, this project also offers opportunities for using distributed modular manufacturing that could be implemented in the farms or landfill sites instead of local, centralized, large-scale biogas digester plants or any other chemical plants, and therefore it could offer job opportunities to rural areas. So in this multidisciplinary research, in addition to lab-scale evaluation of the technology in terms of materials development or process development and investigation, we also need to investigate cost-effectiveness, efficiency, and feasibility from a technical, from environmental, political, and societal perspective. In fact, for successful implementation of such distributed modular technologies, it's essential to carefully assess carbon impact as well as other non-technical impacts. So to briefly talk about this project, the biogas that I'm talking about contains about 50 volume% carbon dioxide or CO2 that needs to be separated from methane in a combined separation conversion unit. That's the focus of this project. The methane could be recovered as biomethane for further use somewhere else, whereas CO2 is subsequently getting converted to biofuels in the form of olefins like ethylene, like propylene, or syngas, which is a mix of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. Of course, over a dual function material that has both adsorption and catalytic functionalities using renewable hydrogen. Now, this single unit operation enables an integrated process that with the potential to save huge cost in capital expenditure of biogas processing. So we have recently demonstrated the feasibility of this approach in a proof of concept study for production of syngas over dual function materials. And why is it important? If in the context of road to resilience, we're talking about energy resiliency here, and this project that we believe is a framework type of project that includes various innovations ranging from materials development at nanoscale all the way up to process level that includes, for example, process engineering as well as benefit cost analysis or any other risk related analysis, all aiming at converting waste biomass into value-added fuels. So finding cost-effective approaches to capture and convert the emitted CO2 will open avenues to sustainable creation of energy with less environmental impacts, and we believe this is a very great way to basically produce value-added or valuable chemicals and fuels from waste biomass. And thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask our speakers to come back up, and we'll have a Q&A session now. I do want to ask Amy how many times she's been stung by bees. So yeah, just go ahead and sit down. And if there's any questions from the audience, now's the time to ask. This one.
Hi, my name's Annette, and this is a question for Amy about the bees. So I'm sorry, I was writing and I couldn't listen at the same time. But did you say that you think there's advantages for the bees that live in large families?
Yeah, so there's some. So what we found with our bumblebees is that a large variety in body size is really helpful. And there's a lot of theory from social insect biology that if you're living in a eusocial colony, that it may be a form of bet hedging, right? So different bees of different sizes seem to be good at, well, large bees are actually better at everything, but small bees may be an insurance policy for really poor environments. There's also some theory that's involved in how bees of these different sizes may be making slightly different choices and that could then bet hedge for, say, a different pattern of flowers, or the phenology changing a little bit, say, during the spring that we have this year, that's something that would help. So that goes back to work on eusociality and in kin selection. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the collective behaviour. So
Right.
together we thrive, and separated we don't.
Yeah, and that seems to be going along with some of that theory.
I have a question for Dr. Corns. What's the trade-off between ever more sophisticated LiDAR models to get the national map versus the type of modeling you do that's predictive? Is there some day in which the LiDAR will replace the predictive modeling such that we can get a real-time image?
So we're actually using LiDAR data now. It's the resolution. We're at 1 meter, if we can get that to 1 foot, if we can get that to 1 inch. But then you have a data explosion. How do you actually work with that much data? Because we're looking at a couple counties worth of data. That's a lot of LiDAR data. So being able to manage that, you could throw it onto a high-performance computer, you could separate it out and do those calculations. But right now, that's developing the model of what are the elevations. There's going to be a certain amount of error in any model you make because all models are wrong. George Box quote. Some are useful. Hopefully these are useful enough to predict when that flooding event is going to be a high enough risk that we need to pull the trigger, shut down that road.
I have more than one, but I'll just ask one for now. Dr. Giles, in your research for the smaller neighborhoods, especially responding to potential weather alerts, did you see a model where it might work, and I'm trying to take it back to the city level, where maybe there's one trusted neighbor that is the person who gets that information? Because you made it sound like people are more likely to trust their neighbors or community members than they are a national alert. So have you seen that replicated or that used? And I also feel like I should say, if anyone else has answers to any of the questions too, raise your hand. Because I realized earlier when someone was I don't know.
No, certainly people rely on, all of us rely on our neighbors and friends to confirm information that we hear from other sources that are not as trusted. And so that is pretty much generally that is part if you're talking about communication. I think one of the interesting problems that we've found in sort of the climate or weather forecasting community is getting the forecasters and the modelers to trust the people that are complaining about their forecast. That valuing them as a trusted source. Well, you don't understand probabilistic forecasting, or just that's not what a model is, or whatever. And so that has been sort of a barrier to trying to improve some of these forecasting systems, because it goes both ways. You have to, it's hard for scientists to trust lay people, because lay people may be correct in their conclusion, but their explanations sometimes are really bizarre. And so it's really hard for scientists to accept that information as trusted as well.
I have another question. Sorry, anyone else can take it from me. Dr. Hall, you did a lot of your research where you had the buildup on the Yosemite River, Yellowstone River. Mm-hmm. And it was showing kind of in county areas, not necessarily in a city, it looked like. Have you guys also been doing research in when we build up the infrastructure in more urban environments, what that does for the health of the systems, and whether or not, as we design our infrastructure for the future, we should be allowing that sort of physical infrastructure buildup?
We are in the largest city in Montana, which is Billings, Montana, which has about 150,000 people in the greater MSA. So just in that context, yes, but applying it to other areas, no. And that's really just based on our funding agency's interests and kind of our prior experience there. certainly we could move to other systems as well. We could take what we're doing and apply it to other settings and problems for that matter.
Hi, this question is for John Trevathan. Thank you so much for that really very interesting talk. I mean, it's so, the language in the biosphere, it's so interesting to me, and I'm so naive in this area. And you're using language as a way of bridging and talking about the complexities of the the extinction. Have you thought about language in the reverse, in the sense of developing or promoting change, and how, even made up words, or how we use language in that very same nuanced way? It's kind of a crazy question, but it's been driving me as I'm thinking about it.
All right. Is it? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, no, I love the question. So the kind of work that I broadly do is ecological literary criticism. So the creative component there, I think, it should be at the forefront, right? So certainly understanding languages as sets of systems that go back in time to examine and look about and think about, but also how can we write and talk about those texts, those languages, those histories in a way that really resonates with our current moment of ecological crisis, the impending notion of ecological collapse, right? And I think that the idea is that we really want to think about creativity in a very large, open way, right? So I tell my students, I teach Spanish language, literature, and culture. I'm constantly telling them that thinking between languages is just opening up entirely your process of thinking. So yeah, absolutely. And really paying attention to the words that we do use to talk about environmental issues, and thinking about how those words can either be problematic or they can move us forward to thinking about different surprising solutions.
Are the fireflies extinct now? Because you sort of hinted that maybe the fireflies had gone away, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, so no, but under threat, definitely. And I think the idea is that, depending on the location, they've either completely disappeared, or like Galicia, the other thing, there's lots of background information that just wasn't in that talk, right? But it's a really rural, idyllic part of Spain, sort of seen as like, oh, we're going to go to a cabin out in the woods in Galicia, right? So really idyllic, but at the same time, there has been a lot of development over the last few decades that has impacted, for example, firefly populations, but still alive. And there's different, also different species in that area that have conjured up some of these different names.
So just a quick, it seems like for the flooding researchers, it seems like Missouri has some strategic advantages with the Missouri and Mississippi rivers flooding through, cutting through the state, hitting both sides, coming through metropolitan areas, and also rural areas as well. So do you agree with that? Is there, do we seem to be in sort of in terms of understanding flooding and the way that flooding can occur in this state, does it seem like Missouri, sort of in terms of projects and research has, I don't want to say advantage, but sort of opportunity in terms of the things that we can study here that wouldn't be as easily studied elsewhere? And could you articulate any of those if there are?
Yes, but on one hand it's really a blessing, but on the other hand it's also a curse, isn't it? So yes, we're in a unique geological position. We have lots of agricultural land. We have the biggest lead mining company in the Western world, headquartered in St. Louis. So we can basically just from a variety standpoint address all the important issues related to flooding: infrastructure, mining, environmental issues, agriculture, and wildlife, because we have the Mark Twain National Forest. And because we also have a very strong University of Missouri system with 4 campuses that are sort of evenly distributed all across the state, I think, we really have a lot of potential to really make ourselves the global leader. Anybody else?
Just a little bit more on that. As we look at watersheds, just the drainage basins, we have probably about half the drainage basin of the U.S. coming through Missouri. with the Missouri River, drainage from that area, drainage from the Mississippi. So there's a lot of opportunities. There's also a lot of different size water streams. We're looking at the Mississippi River for flooding, which is fairly significant, very large river, but we also have Merrimack River. So we can look at some of the aspects there. We also have knowledge of some of the underground rivers. So what's happening with the subterranean water flows. That also gives us another opportunity if we're looking at the Rubidoux, I believe it is, we have records of, for how that flows across Dent County up towards Fort Leonard Wood. So there's a lot of interesting different aspects, also centralized in the U.S., and we're very close to, say, Army Corps of Engineers. We have a good working relationship with them with System. So I think we have a lot of opportunities to really move forward with this.
Yeah, I'll add one thing to that. I think St. Louis, because the metropolitan statistical area has around 200 individual cities that are right next to each other. I think there's a lot of capacity to innovate policy solutions for working together. Because if we're all just trying to increase our tax base, we're infringing closer and closer to flood areas and areas we know will flood. I think there's capacity to try to figure out how we can work together in order to mitigate flooding or the damage of flooding. Flooding is natural. Yeah.
I had a quick question over here. Sorry. First, I wanted to thank everybody for interesting papers that got me thinking. I'm actually from the Department of Ancient Mediterranean Studies, so a lot of this was kind of new to me. But I live in Colombia, so disasters in terms of snow and ice and flooding is sort of second nature. But I wanted to ask John a question also about your paper. I mean, we teach Greek and Latin, so language extinction is a phrase that resonates. But I think about it more in terms of resilience because of the way that languages, flow into new languages. But that opening image of that snail alone in the aquarium, in this terrarium, raised the idea of the individual versus languages, which to me are very communal. So I guess I was wondering, first of all, were you thinking about language extinction like the snail in terms of just being isolated? Or was that a metaphor that you were kind of using? I was a little unclear because I think about Latin and that's and Greek, that some ancient Greek that survive in English. They are very resilient. They are not isolated. They don't die off in the way that that poor snail did. So could you say a little bit more about that? I know this is all in your research that but just a little bit more to clarify. Thanks.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So I think with regards to my own work, this is looking at Iberian languages that certainly are products of, say, Latin and Greek, some variation therein. But you have Basque, for example, right? So that minority language, for example, is sort of isolated, no connection to any other known language. We're not really sure why it's there or why they're there, right? So you have this sort of island, isolated monad thinking there, right? You extend that to other very ancient indigenous languages that have either already disappeared, we have no record of them, we have no connection, we have no idea how to connect them to what we have today in terms of knowledge of different languages. So it's really like, it depends on the situation, I think, right? So you do have languages no longer spoken that have lots of research, lots of attention given, but then the concern is that we're losing, especially on the indigenous side, all of these different languages that might offer some other kind of knowledge that we really should be taking into account today, and we're not, right? So I think that highlighting George dying alone, the idea there is that we really need to be attentive to what the state of these various languages are, what state they're in today, and where that's headed, is the idea. Thanks.
Now is it working? So I have an observation, and then I'll follow up with a question. The observation is that the state of Missouri has some uniqueness in terms of its diversity, agriculturally, urban, rural, politically. A lot of diversity here. And also the uniqueness of having a 4-campus system with the diversity of research. This is, I think, the 5th summit, research summit. You started here in Columbia, maybe. I missed one, but, and you can tell the uniqueness of the campuses and how deep the research is in different areas. There are several systems that are much larger than Missouri, but to have 4 campuses to deal with is manageable. To have an extension service that has an office in each county. Now, they usually give educational information. They're providers of services, but have any of you ever thought of them as research associates, where you could do a research study and involve the extension offices in gathering information, or not all 114 or however many there are, but those that you need to create diversity for your study? It seems to me that I mean, they're there, they're being paid, they're of service to Missouri, and the ultimate function of a land-grant institution is to gather information for the benefit of Missourians and more broadly. So I have a question for you, and that is, have you thought about it? Might that be something that you would consider doing? Ease of gathering empirical information for some of your studies.
I think many of us have done it. I think that there's even in some of our overseas work, we've engaged people from Extension. I think that you have to be careful. They're sort of busy people as well, and their better role is to help you figure out a local way to gather data than to use their time to gather data in most cases. But yes, I think that's a resource we use frequently and will continue to use.
Yes, as well. And I've worked with them in Maine and in Missouri and Montana.
Hi, I'm Eric Evans from the Department of Mental Health. I'm back here. First, I want to volunteer to go to either Montana or Silesia with you and support you in all your work. I'll go as many times as you want to go. I'm very flexible. Also, I appreciate all the work you all do. It's such a unique, I've been doing emergency management for 32 years. So I'm going to challenge you. There's one aspect of this that's missing in a lot of this, and that's the human factor. You want to put a barrier up 15 minutes earlier? Of all the 8 people that died in Missouri in the last few weeks from flooding, every one of them was from moving a barrier and driving around it. Every one. So good luck with that. We need to improve the human side of this equation, which is a lot of the problems that are causing this is the human side of this equation. But that is a big issue. We need to address the people that, like in Joplin, they didn't pay any attention to the warning sirens at all, which is why they all died. So this is a big problem. We're dealing with the aftermath of what humans have caused, but we're not dealing with the cause, which is humans. So that would be a great research roundtable with the social sciences to see if anyone's addressing those issues of that. Thank you.
To you, excuse me, the man in the blue jacket, John. I just say this because I've been reading about it the last 5 days. But to your point, so the Netherlands, they set a goal 20 years ago to produce twice as much food for half as much resources, and they are the world #2 exporter of food, in value-wise, second to the US. The US has 270 times their land mass. And from all the reading that I've done, I can see 3 key things that they've done on this. And this is to your point. The researchers at Wageningen avoided the top-down approach. They focused on the needs of the small growers and on the weather, the soil conditions, and the costs that they faced. So they pulled from extension people, what do you need and we'll research that. The other thing they did was that they had regular meetings with farmers and researchers and created this recognition that nobody has all the answers themselves. So they worked together to come up with innovative ideas. So it was a lot of researchers listening to the farmers. And they increased the number of women and international students in their research labs. So those seem to be the three key things that are getting it done for them.
So we're going to follow up with everyone by sending out an email. Like Mark alluded to earlier, the Research Development Network, our grant writers, put together a very nice document of like 19 pages of different funding opportunities in the resilience area of research. So we want to be able to share that with you. And I'll be following up with our speakers as well to talk about maybe some collaborations that our campuses can assist you with. So again, I'd like to thank our speakers. You guys did a great job. I know it's really difficult to have professors give only a 5-minute talk, and you guys all did really great. And thanks to the audience, too, for your participation.